a special presentation the first week of April, possibly, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Today's agenda, I'm going to go over the recent conditions in the climate and the snow and soils and streams. I'll spend a little bit of time going over some of the impacts that the region has experienced over the past month. I certainly can't hit them all because there are way too many. Then we'll do an outlook and kick it over to Jim Knoll to do that spring flood outlook section. Starting with the statewide average temperature ranks, this is for the winter time period, so December, January, February. Released by NOAA, it ranks temperature on the upper left, precipitation on the lower right, out of a 124-year record. Main thing I want to highlight is that for the entire U.S., the nationwide average, this was the wettest winter in that 124-year record, and you can see that a lot of that is attributable to wet conditions, high ranking wetness in the central region. For February specifically, we had kind of mixed bag over the central region for temperature rankings, with the north and west side looking at a little bit below average temperatures, a lot below for the Dakotas and Montana, and shifting towards closer to average and a little bit warmer than average around the Ohio River Valley in those states. And again, wetter than average for most of the central region. Second wettest February on record for nationwide for the U.S. Let's bring it back to kind of what got us to where we are today. And if we look back at the calendar year for 2018, there were areas of the central region that had their record wettest year, particularly if you look in some areas of South Dakota, Nebraska into Iowa, and much above average precipitation for a lot of the region. And here's what our last 90 days have looked like, just to kind of get your eyes adjusted to what we're looking at. Here's Nebraska, north into South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota here, Iowa. And these purple colors, we're looking at 200% to 300% of average precipitation over a 90-day period. So an incredible amount of moisture in the region that we're looking at. The cold and wet pattern has continued for a lot of this region. These are departure from normal temperatures over the last 30 days. Extremely cold in the Dakotas and Montana, a little bit less cold, but still very cold as you extend into Nebraska and Iowa and Minnesota. And that continued wetness, 300% of average moisture over a 30-day period right here in South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa area. So here's a look at the snowpack, which partially contributes to the central region from looking at Montana down through Wyoming and into Colorado. Colorado specific, I will say we are ecstatic about these numbers. This is going to be incredibly helpful to water supplies that really struggled from our drought last year. Pretty good water supply, snowpack getting ready to melt through Wyoming and Montana, with a little bit drier individual stations showing up in northern Montana and northern Wyoming, but overall not bad. Specifically looking at some time series of snowpack, North Platte on the left, South Platte on the right. Typically you see snowpack follow the red line, that's the 1981 to 2010 average, well above the peak already. Typical peak is in early April. So any we get is already over that peak there and very close to the peak on the South Platte. And this is looking at Missouri River Basin snowpack, not quite as high as it is in the Platte, but tracking right near average on both of these, Fort Peck to Garrison and above Fort Peck. Also looking at a typical peak around early to mid-April, which means that's about the time we're going to start seeing some melt-off from these and increased runoff from that snowpack. Snowpack that may be of great interest to a lot of people on the phone right now is what we're seeing in the Dakotas and Minnesota. I've circled this area here showing that there is still about 4 to 8 inches of snowpack just waiting to start melting, and that is going to be a huge concern for future flooding in these states and these areas and downstream as that starts to melt. So this is a soil moisture product that looks at the percentile ranking of soil moisture throughout the country. And basically, the more green to blue, the more wet the soils are, and then your yellows and oranges and reds are more dry soils. And what we can see here is where we've had a lot of the flooding issues, we do have incredibly wet soils showing up in that modeled soil moisture product. And pretty much this line here is where we're talking about soils still being frozen. And so the soil moisture rankings that you see here are an indication of what the soil moisture was like before the soils froze at the beginning of the cold season. So I'm sure that these greens and blues will start to expand northward as those soils begin to thaw. Kind of a similar look when you look at the stream flow maps. This is a 28-day average stream flow across the country. And it's not that we don't have stream flow in the Dakotas and Minnesota, it's that most of these gauges are still ice affected or frozen, and so there's not anything to report there. But as you get to a little bit of the warmer climates, we're starting to see very high flows throughout the rivers, major rivers and tributaries in the central region. This map shows it a little more nicely. These blue colors, we're talking about above 90th percentile. So out of 100 years, only 10 years would have higher flows in these rivers and tributaries, and the black are record high flows. So we have already issues with major flooding where you see those blues and blacks, and it's expected that we're going to start see those expand northward as those gauges come out from being ice affected and the snow melt starts melting in these northern states. So it's going to be a huge water problem coming towards us very soon. So the good news about all this is that we don't have very much drought in the central region, the biggest exceptions being in Colorado, although this map looks pretty darn good compared to what it looked like a year ago at this time, a little bit in Wyoming. This number here of the percent area in drought is that less than 1% of this entire area is in a drought category, D1 to D4. The last time we had that small of a percentage of this area in drought, you have to go back to May of 2017. So it's been a while, and we've just swung from one extreme to the other. Here's a quick look at the ice cover over the Great Lakes. Biggest point to say here is that the ice cover is above average for this time of year, but not record-breaking. So switching over to impacts, I wanted to share a couple of these from Weather Nation. Please visit that website to see lots of these satellite images, fascinating, through Nebraska and Iowa, where the before image shows what the river typically looks like, and then clearly so much water spreading out, not just from the river, but over land and crops. And we're seeing that all throughout this region here in Iowa, Nebraska, and into Missouri even.
Do you remember, Becky, where that was exactly?
This one said Hamburg, Iowa.
Yep.
the first one, and then the other one's near Omaha.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. I got pulled this from the Des Moines Register, just a little plot showing when you're looking from the Nebraska state line and the Iowa state line where we've seen partial breaches or total breaches of levees throughout the region from this flooding. And this is just quite significant how much red and yellow you see here of these levees being breached by all this excessive water. One of the big problems in Nebraska has also been ice jams coming down the river. These giant ice blocks, a picture taken from the Nebraska State Patrol shows those giant blocks of ice just covering the highway. It's also done things such as broken through railroad bridges and other highway bridges. It's been quite devastating, but really cool pictures. So the one on left is from Brian Fuchs, who works at the Drought Mitigation Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he has property in central Nebraska that has had major flooding and ice issues. And these issues have extended into northwest Missouri. This picture on the right is from a Missouri Extension office showing the flooding going over the highway there. Some of the specific impacts we've been hearing over the past couple of weeks, specifically to livestock, the extreme wetness last year led to a late harvest, and so there were issues with baled hay having mold and poor nutritional content. So while the cattle are still eating it, they're not getting the nourishment, which already makes them weak. And then you add on the current conditions of cold and wet, a lot of areas seeing rain that switches to snow, and this is resulting in wet and matted coats on the cattle. So they're suffering from hypothermia. They can't stay insulated from the cold. They're going into distress. A lot of muddy fields the cattle are getting stuck in, and some can be rescued, many cannot. Large snow events and blizzards are also burying cattle, so there are cattle losses from that. This is a really critical season for livestock, as this is the calving season, so there's vulnerability issues there. We've heard about calves, if they were born during these blizzard conditions we had last week and they weren't immediately rescued, they were lost. A lot of the livestock has been swept away in the flooding that I've talked about. And there's also been losses with pigs due to damage to barns in the floods. As far as crop impacts, we don't have as much in the way of impacts right now. There is a little bit of damage being reported to winter wheat from, especially around the Ohio Valley, extreme cold, bare ground, no snow cover to insulate, so there's excessive damage there. In Kansas, due to cold temperatures and timing of precipitation and rain versus snow, their winter wheat is about a month behind. And in South Dakota, we've heard that melting and refreezing has damaged the crops there. Corn, the biggest issue is going to be that late planting is almost certain to happen because of these excessively wet conditions. The eastern part of the Corn Belt is faring a little bit better, but there's really no talk of early field work at this time. Nebraska, grain storage facilities have been destroyed by the flooding. It's also something that we're not seeing yet, but is going to be a concern, is the high risk of disease in crops if these conditions stay wet. So I'm pretty sure everybody in the central region ag sector is really hoping for a good long chunk of dry weather. And I have bad news on that. More coming. Transportation impacts are going to be huge from what we've seen. On the east side of the central region in the Ohio Cumberland system, barges have been unable to transport in either direction due to the high waters and flooding. Interstate and state highways in Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri have been heavily damaged or are closed. Railroads and bridges have been damaged from flooding and from those ice dams. So cross-country transport is going to be heavily impacted by this, whether you're talking about by train or by truck. In Kansas, the report is that the Kansas City-St. Louis Amtrak line is also now closed. So this is all due to so much water. So Nebraska, the story is that they received excessive snowfall for the season and then added on top of that an additional 1 to 3 inches of rain. Rain on top of snow is never a good thing. And so they basically went from winter to spring in a 24-hour period, leading to a lot of that devastation that we're seeing there. Iowa, the flooding is the worst in the southwest corner of the state, due also to that less than ideal melting of snowpack with rain on snow events. Minnesota has fared a bit better. They've melted the snowpack the way you really want to see it, nice and slow and easy, above freezing temperatures in the day, but still dipping below freezing overnight. So not nearly the impacts there, with really more minor flooding. If we go into northern Minnesota, though, in the Dakotas, there's a lot of preparation for more flooding to come. So quite a bit of focus on the levees, a lot of sandbagging. There's not much movement from the Red River Basin yet, but significant flood risk and preparations. So in those areas, they know it's coming. It's likely to be bad. It's just not here yet. And in Ohio, one interesting tidbit that Jim Knoll gave yesterday was that the largest flood control project east of the Mississippi at Lake Cumberland hit an all-time record crest, and that was 5 feet above the previous record. And this is a system, it's important because it protects Kentucky and Tennessee from flooding. Economic impacts, we are not going to have any idea on this anytime soon, definite numbers, but we are getting some initial numbers in. And Nebraska, we're already looking at over $1 billion in damage, and that number's growing. Specifically, over $400 million in losses to livestock and over $400 million for row and grain crops. In Kansas, the state climate office there has been dealing with 40 different counties needing weather data so they can file their livestock indemnity claims and payments. For the levies, a very off-the-cuff casual estimate, we won't know for sure, but initial number was around $8 billion just needed to repair the levees that have been damaged by this flooding. And another initial estimate, one county in Iowa at $7 million lost to yield that was being stored. So this is quite devastating, and it's not over yet. Let's take a look at what is to come. Sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but it's not dry weather. This is the 7-day precipitation forecast over the United States from the Weather Prediction Center. Really, we're looking at large areas getting more than 1/4 inch of rain, or probably rain, some snow in the next 7 days. Thankfully, not as much over the Dakotas and Minnesota. Unfortunately, this bullseye right here around Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri is certainly not going to be helpful, with another inch of moisture being forecasted. Additionally, as you go over into the Ohio, Kentucky area, much more precipitation, over an inch being forecasted for that area as well. In Colorado, we happen to like seeing these precipitation forecasts, so it's good news for us. Going out 2 weeks, focusing on the 8 to 14-day outlook put out by the Climate Prediction Center. The left side shows temperature outlook, and the right is the precipitation outlook. When you see these blue colors on the temperature, what we're seeing is an increased chance of below average temperatures The more blue it is really just means there's more confidence of below average temperatures that we're seeing, particularly where we've got our mountain snowpack still, and the snowpack probably still holding on in the Dakotas for a little bit longer. On the right side, green is increased chance of above average precipitation, and we unfortunately have a bullseye here in the upstream areas of the central region, and widespread chances of above average precipitation throughout the central region. This is a hazards outlook also released by the Climate Prediction Center, where they look at where there might be a risk of heavy precipitation events, and where we have on that precipitation map that little bullseye over Montana, Wyoming, and into the Dakotas shows up here as having a slight risk of heavy precipitation events over that over week 2, so the 8 to 14 day outlook, and then unfortunately a slight risk of heavy precipitation throughout the Missouri, Mississippi River area. Looking a little bit long term, we are currently in a El Nino, a weak event, and it is expected that that will continue into the summer. The red bars show the likelihood of an El Nino event versus gray is neutral or blue La Nina. So as we get into the summer, this May, June, July, August time period, we still have a over 60% chance of El Nino conditions, and not very likely that we would go into a La Nina. So most likely El Nino into the summer. The plot on the right shows the intensity of that El Nino from the climate models, and most of them are sticking in that weak El Nino, which is between the 0.5 and 1 anomaly here. So if you kind of look at the average, this thick blue line is what the CPC is estimating. So through the summer, it's looked to stay a weak El Nino, which is going to impact the climate outlooks that we will be looking at. First, looking at April. Again, we've got the temperature on the left side and precipitation on the right side. The April outlook is that a lot of the central region will be more likely to see below average temperatures, but as you go east towards the Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky area, then the temperatures are more likely to be above average. If we look at precipitation, just a very slightly enhanced probability of above average precipitation right there over the High Plains region. Extending out, the first seasonal outlook we'll look at is the April, May, June time period, and we continue to see that increased chance of below average temperatures in much of the central region. A lot of this is being driven by what the models are showing with El Nino indicators, but also extremely wet soils. You tend to have a feedback. Wet soils, more precipitation inhibits the amount that the temperature can warm up, so you're more likely to not get to average temperatures, which is what we're seeing there. And then if we go into the precipitation outlook for the April, May, June time period, increased chance of above average precipitation over Colorado, Wyoming, extending into western Nebraska and western Kansas, very slightly above average chance in the rest of the central region. And pretty much a similar story, but this is just extending out that outlook a little bit further into the May, June, July. So capturing the majority of the summer time period, we still see that cold signal in a lot of Nebraska, Kansas, where we've had a lot of that flooding, and then that increased chance of above average precipitation throughout much of the region. And this is going to be really critical when you're talking about crops in terms of when are we going to have a dry period to plant the crops. So while we want a little bit warmer, drier weather to come, it's not looking as likely in the outlooks. I'll stop there. I don't, if we want to talk about partners and questions after Jim gives his presentation. Do we want to kick it over to Jim now?
I'm going to change it to Jim here just a second.
All righty. There we go. You should be able to see my screen there, Doug, right?
Yes. Looks
okay.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Becky. I'm just going to give a quick update on our spring flood outlook that the NOAA and the National Weather Service have issued today, and kind of drill down a little bit into the Midwest region and what that means for us. We should also have our technical experts from the River Forecast Centers on. I'm at the Ohio River Forecast Center here in the Ohio Valley. And then Corey Loveland is from the North Central River Forecast Center, covering the upper Mississippi River and Red River of the north. And also Kevin Lau is covering the Missouri Basin. So today, the National Weather Service and NOAA issued the spring flood outlook. And this is, there's a link at the bottom here that it just came out here at about 11 a.m. Eastern, 10 a.m. Central Time today. And what we're expecting is, as Becky has been talking with the outlooks and the past conditions, because of the wet conditions, we are expecting significant flooding, either ongoing in portions of like the Missouri Basin and a little bit of the upper Mississippi Basin, as well as along the Mississippi River already, as well as future flood risk. Our outlook is calling for really the central U.S. The orange areas are minor flooding. The red areas are moderate flooding in terms of what we categorize it as. And then the purple areas are major flooding expected in these areas. That includes portions of the eastern Missouri Basin, the upper Mississippi Basin, the Mississippi Main Stem River itself, and portions of the Red River of the north. We're also expecting some additional or renewed flooding from the mid-Mississippi Valley into the Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland valleys. The flooding has been relaxing in the eastern portion of the Midwest. It kind of began there in February and then has been slowly expanding westward into the Mississippi and then into the Missouri Basin here into the month of March. And again, that link is at the bottom there that you can get a lot of additional information about the NOAA National Weather Service Spring Flood Outlook. On the next slide here, we're going to drill down a little bit into the different areas for the upper Mississippi River Basin for the next 5 days. Again, a link to the North Central River Forecast Center. We are expecting a fairly wide area of minor to major flooding to continue really for the next several weeks, depending on what area you're in. This is over the next 5 days. This link here showing a good portion of southern Minnesota, parts of southern Wisconsin, into Iowa and western Illinois, expecting the likelihood of some significant flooding. Also, ice jams are still a big threat in the upper Mississippi Basin. Some of that ice has been moving, but there's still a lot of ice jam action going on until we get a little bit further into the spring warm-up season. This is a screen capture of today's river forecast over the next week with like the highest category. And as you can see, the scattered areas of major flooding in portions of the Minnesota, Mississippi River system with additional minor to moderate flooding. So it really depends on where you're at right now. And then really going forward, it's going to depend on future rainfall, how the snow melts. If we get these fast warm-ups, as Becky was talking about, that storm a few weeks ago was very significant, and it brought very warm air very quickly and caused rapid runoff combined with rainfall. If we get that kind of scenario again over the next 1 or 2 months in some of these areas, that will lead, to more significant flooding. If we can get a gradual melt-off of that snowpack in the Red River, the north portions of the upper Mississippi and Missouri basins, that will help some, but you're still going to get significant rain rises on the rivers. But again, so it's all in how future crests are really going to be driven by how that temperature and precipitation pattern really plays out. Further into the Missouri Basin, more of the same. There's significant flooding going on the Missouri main stem, as well as the Big Sioux and really southeast South Dakota, northwestern Iowa, and eastern Nebraska over the last week have been, as you know, hit hard. And additional flood potential is definitely there on a significant level. There's potential for major flooding. Already 30 points have been recorded in the Missouri River Forecast Center's area of reaching new records. So very, very significant widespread flooding. Combination of that snow melt, rainfall, and ice jam action led to that. And this is just a summary for the Missouri Basin that they're expecting mountain snowpack to be about normal so far this winter. And significant flooding from the snow melt alone is not expected, but there is potential for some ice jams to continue in the Missouri Basin, especially from Wyoming on into especially into South Dakota and that area up there. There's still a lot of snowpack in eastern North Dakota, South Dakota, along with those wet soil conditions. So the big rivers that are of threat right now in the Missouri Basin include the James Vermilion and the Big Sioux in South Dakota. Many rivers will be cresting over the next couple weeks. But again, as we go further along down the road, it's all going to transition from snowmelt to thunderstorm activity and how the spring storms. I will say the weather pattern has been extremely active from Japan across the Pacific Ocean into the U.S. That is one of the big reasons that's led to the very wet winter across the United States, record wetness across the U.S. And looking really at those projections, it looks to remain active at least for the next 2 to 4 weeks, if not longer, as the climate outlooks have shown. Further to the east, just to finish up here, in the Ohio Basin, things are calming down. We still have some minor flooding across portions of the eastern Illinois, southwest Indiana, and the lower Ohio Basin, but things are improving. However, we do look towards enhanced rainfall in the next 1 to 3 weeks that could result in renewed flooding. The lower right image is a 16-day rainfall graphic that we input into our modeling systems for outlooks, and it is showing a widespread area of 1 to 3 inches or more, and that kind of goes along with what Becky was showing with the precipitation probabilities over the next few weeks. So I'm going to be turning it back to Doug, but I do want to highlight detailed questions going forward during the flood threat over the next 2 to 4 weeks or beyond. Really, we drive them to our local National Weather Service forecast offices, and then they work with the regional river forecast centers. There's also some links on here to get the long-range outlooks. That's in the green link. And our real-time AHPS, Advanced Hydrologic Prediction Service for river forecasts, that link is in blue, and you can always get the latest information at weather.gov. So I will turn it back to Doug now for any questions on anything.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Becky, for the presentations. Very helpful. There are a few questions we'll get to. I just wanted to say that it's likely that we'll ramp up a few services here in coordination with various NOAA and USDA, Dennis Toddy and such, over the next few weeks, trying to continue getting the information out as we get it. We're trying to schedule something in a couple weeks to do something like this, maybe focused primarily on flooding and potential and all that kind of thing. But more on that later. As far as the questions go, Dennis, I'm going to pull you in first. The question here is, and by the way, as Jim mentioned, Jim Knoll from Ohio River Basin, and then Corey Loveland from the north central, basically upper Mississippi and Red River of the North. basins as his responsibility, and then Kevin Lau for the Missouri Basin. They're all hydrologists. They all sort of watch over this stuff closely. If there's any questions on streams and flood potential and all that kind of stuff, they're the ones to answer that. They're on the line. And thank you for being here. You can raise your hand as well if you want. There's a little way to do that on the interface here if you care to do that. And I'll just unmute you, and you can go ahead and talk. I'm going to get to the questions now, though, as you think about those things. Are there delayed, Dennis, are there delayed planting concerns from the flooding? How many acres of winter wheat were impacted by the flooding, if anybody knows that, by the way? So go ahead, Dennis.
Yeah, directly on the flooding itself, there were probably not huge acres directly impacted on winter wheat. Most of those areas would have been more of the snowpack issues and the freeze thaw. The delayed planting, nothing is really delayed yet, but we know from the inundated areas, particularly, things will probably be delayed for sure in those locations. If there probably will be some areas that will not be able to be planted this year, period. Delayed planting is an issue over the whole region because, referring back to the image that Becky showed you on the way of soil moisture, we have wet soils over the whole region. So any additional rainfall is going to be problematic. So nothing is delayed yet, but there will be, we know there probably will be some delays. I guess the other issues are in the northern areas where we would plant small grains up in the Dakotas. We'll probably delayed there too because we still have snow on the ground we have to get rid of before we can even start drying out soils.
And Dennis, do you want to talk a little bit about impacts in the river floodplains in terms of not only delayed planting but issues with sand and silt and all that business?
Right. That's the other problem. We know. Well, let me broaden to one more other issue. Where the snow melt has occurred already, this happened in Iowa and Nebraska, we probably had soil degradation or loss or nutrient loss because we had so much water traveling over land areas, not even getting into the main parts of streams, that we probably lost some soils, lost some nutrients in that, which has added to the problems. And then the areas that are heavily inundated, the soils there will be degraded because of depositing of sand. Silt is not so bad because that's a bit better, but the additional deposits of sand will degrade the soils and cause some problems as we go along here. So those are mainly on the river bottom areas where you have water that sits for a long period of time, but we will have losses of soil in upland areas because of the amount of water that was done. The other thing that didn't get mentioned too was the damage that was done because of ice. We had large movement of large blocks of ice, so there was a lot of damage done to things like bridges because of the ice, and then other structural areas and other loss of soil because of large movement of ice over the regions.
Okay, thank you. Is there a central location? Does anybody know, either on the call or in the panel section? Does anybody know if there's a central location, state by state, to get weather-related livestock indemnity loss information?
For the amount of losses already, or if they want to report?
I'm sure they want the reports.
Okay,
So
not yet. Those will take a little bit of time to accumulate.
Yeah. Yeah, for reporting, she clarified. This person has left the call, but the question was, are the monthly outlooks a good representation of the full month, or do they get skewed toward the predictable early part of the month? And that's a great question. And the answer is the latter. Absolutely. The more secure we are, the more confident we are in the first 2 weeks of a month, often will steer the direction of that particular forecast. So those monthly forecasts, let's say for April, do get updated just before April. So we have this version now, and in April 30th or sometime around then, there'll be a new version of the monthly outlook for April, and that will take into account all the new model data and all that other stuff. So absolutely, the first couple weeks do skew that forecast slightly, no doubt.
And I guess also to add on to that, Doug, if there is an extreme one way or the other, that will also skew the whole month. We saw that going into March, that first part of March we knew was going to be very cold, so that no matter what happened at the end of March, it was very unlikely to balance that cold period out.
And I see we have an answer to, or at least a partial answer to the Livestock Indemnity Program reports, and the Farm Service Agency state offices should be contacted for those LIP reports. Thank you, Dawn. Let's see. Any other questions or comments? Oops, wait a minute. Hold on. I've got a question here. Hold on, Kevin. Let's see. I can't unmute you for some reason. I guess you don't have a PIN entered, Kevin Grevenow. I'm sorry about that. I will invite you to email me with your question, and we will try to. Oh, the audio PIN, in case you care, is 169 $. That might work. I don't know. Otherwise, Kevin. Yeah.
Can you hear me, Doug? Can you hear me?
I can. Oh, hey. Thank you. Go ahead.
I want the window to be out.
Yeah, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm doing operations as I'm doing something else. So, what was the question? I'm sorry. I'll just get back with you, John.
Oh, well, I'm sorry. It wasn't a question for you. It was a different Kevin was trying to ask the question. Sorry, Kevin. Kevin Lau.
Okay,
yeah,
well,
and
I'm live then.
Okay, thanks, Kevin. The question was, is this presentation public, and where is it if I want it? And so let me go back and change my presenter back to Becky. And Becky, can you pull up the your presentation and where this recording will be?
Yeah, you
Becky,
see it on the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, so
yeah.
What's that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
So yeah,
the top two links show where you can get today's and past recorded presentations at our two regional climate centers, the Midwestern Regional Climate Center, the High Plains Regional Climate Center. They should be there very soon today.
All right. Thank you, Becky. Looking at the time, we still have about 10 minutes. Any comments from anybody else on this panel? Or questions you want to ask ourselves? If not, let's see. Hold on. We have another question. Information from the Corps call this week indicated more active weather pattern over the next 4 weeks. Does that mean snow, rain, or thunderstorms, or all three? I think Jim Knoll, probably you better answer that one.
All right. So, well, certainly with like Becky was showing, with the below normal temperatures upcoming in the north, it does look like there's several big storms lined up. Doesn't look as significant as the one that went through, 1 to 2 weeks ago it was, but certainly there is risk for the combination of not the ice jam and all that stuff's going to be contained more up in Corey's area and a little bit of Kevin Lau's Missouri up in South Dakota and that. So it's really starting to get contained up north. But the rainfall and the flood threat, it's going to be more driven by the rain and thunderstorms going forward. And but certainly any snow that falls in South Dakota into Minnesota and Wisconsin it doesn't stick around as long as you get into April, so that'll add to the flood threat. But down anything south of probably, an Interstate 80 line is mainly, from thunderstorms and rainfall going forward.
Right. All right. Any other comments from any of the other basins in terms of hydrologists? Or Dennis, do you have any other things you want to say? Becky?
I don't think I have anything to add.
All right.
Yeah, Doug, I'll just throw on one more thing. There are, from the ag side, there are a number of direct impacts. There's going to be some indirect impacts that will come into play, as in, moving corn to ethanol plants, and then the coming out of ethanol plants is ethanol itself, and then the distiller's grains, which is used as a feed product. Until we get rail traffic up and moving again, there's probably going to be some problems with those areas. We're going to have issues with disposal of the livestock, because not only are they deceased, you have to do something with them, or you can introduce some disease problems. So there's work going on that, and the individual states are doing some. Nebraska's been hit most heavily, so they have been working on this, and their state extension work and Department of Agriculture has been putting out issues. But if there are other questions related to this, we will try to direct people the right way to try to work our way out of this ongoing issue.
Thank you, Dennis. By the way, the Amtrak train across Missouri from Kansas City to St. Louis, the reason that has been, if you will, postponed or canceled is that other rail traffic has sort of taken over because it's been shunted to that line. Thus, the Amtrak line is less, or the Amtrak folks, I guess, are taking a second, sort of second tier, if you will.
Yeah, the other part about the flooding in this area around Omaha is there are two major rail lines that go through that area, and it is kind of a choke point for rail traffic. And both those lines were damaged. One of them is starting. The Union Pacific has started opening up again, it appears. The BNSF one just south of Omaha is still not open yet. So they're trying to divert traffic to other areas, which is the issue Doug talked about. And up until the last couple days, there were some line issues still from the blizzard areas up in South Dakota. So multiple problems have occurred here that are compounding each other.
All right, that looks like that's about it from everyone. So I thank everybody who got on. First of all, the audience as well as the speakers very much. We'll do this again soon, and stay tuned. Thank you very much. Have a great day.